Okay. Anyone else? I had no other cards on that issue. Mr. Fiorini.
I'm all for keeping things as simple as possible. I would recommend that we select option 2, go with the language in the 5th draft, with the understanding that we are calling for a transfers work group to take a look at not just annual transfers, but all transfers and report back to us a comprehensive set of recommendations. So I think at this point, option 2 would be the best way to proceed.
Okay. Since I raised this issue, I was interested in making sure that we did not approve what we call a temporary water transfer when in fact it was a long-term water transfer and nobody had analyzed the issues. So I'd buy option 1 on the staff recommendation, but I do note, and Randy made a good point, we have a recommendation for DWR to prepare this, what do we call it, work group, something, to actually delve into this issue particularly. I would support going back to the 5th draft language. It's exempt. If there were a sunset on that exemption that is tied to the expectation of the completion of the work group activities. So, for example, you have 2 years to do the study and make DWR recommendations on the whole thing. Then we come back and look at it again. But I also know without the sunset, it'll drag on for 76 years because all these things are complicated. That's the only process to me that offers, it's a little simpler. It plays off on your point of trying to be as simple as you can, but actually taking what tools we have available to encourage other agencies to move on this issue. Now, I'm just making this up out of whole cloth, I suppose. Dan?
Well, I don't have a detailed point of view on this. I have been a champion within the office of the administrative exemption process. We've heard again and again from local governments and others concerned that routine activities will become burdened with the requirement to file consistency certifications. And so we've done a great deal to try to build administrative exemptions into the plan, unlike some other statutes which authorize, like, for example, on the coast or in the Tahoe, authorize those agencies clearly to identify administrative exemptions. In the plan, we're making findings that we believe these activities won't have a significant effect on the co-equal goals, and so for that reason, they're exempt. I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize our ability to defend the exemptions that we're granting in the plan, because I think they're really important, and this is the way that the staff felt we could best do that. So that would be my only concern with the approach you're recommending.
Mr. Stevens, Randy's got a suggestion. We go back to the 5th draft still plan. That's option 2, and that is simply granting exemption to short-term transfers. Refresh my memory. Did that language in the 5th draft include a reference to CEQA?
I don't believe it did. I think it was.
Yeah,
it
was
a blanket.
But again, back on the issue, the reference to CEQA is what we tried to add, and again, that leaves off all the pre-1914 transfers that are subject to CEQA.
Right.
So
well,
I think
here is what you heard Mr. Fiori and I playing off. My thought is that temporary transfers of up to 1 year might be okay based on our notion of the study committee being formed, but I want that exemption to be sunsetted in a short period of time to actually prod them to do the work. A minor question of whether we don't need to at least reference the CEQA exemption, because otherwise, during a 2-year period, for example, anything can happen? I mean, where are we legally on that?
Well,
idea?
I think that you are, if you go back to the 5th draft, the transfers are going to have to comply with the law that's out there. So let's be clear.
Right.
And the process that we're trying to do here is focused on the Delta plan and whether or not to grant an exemption from our jurisdiction. But we're not implying that the water transfers are going to be able to do something that they aren't already going to, that they have to follow the law. So I think that if there's the exemption going back to the 5th staff draft, and if you sunset it and tie it to the work group coming up with some kind of recommendation package as to how we should address the issue or not, I think that you would be okay. I think Dan's point is one that is the point that I've always taken. What we're trying to present you with is the exemption with the most justification possible with regard to significant impact. And it's not only for your decision, it's for, again, it's a lot of the stakeholders are proposing these exemptions. So to the extent that there are actual justifications that we can point to in the plan that form the basis for the exemptions, the stronger the case is if those exemptions are ever challenged. So that's our approach.
Can I speak bluntly? I think what council is afraid of is that if we put an exemption in here that is not well documented about why we think they're exempt, that someone in, say, the upper watershed who opposes transfers could go to court, get this provision of the plan thrown out because it's arbitrary and capricious, and then all the transfers would be required to do to be covered actions, or potentially be required to be covered actions. So the real issue here is how, is it enough? I actually think the chair's suggestion for saying we're going to do this for a couple of years while we look at the issue may in fact provide the legal clarity and is a reasonable position. Frankly, I don't think it will matter in the long run, whichever direction we go. It's more a nuance.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry to be so
Ms.
blunt.
Gray.
Just a comment. I had a question also. Of the 2% that was referred to, we're not sure if that will impact the delta. Is that why the concern is in terms of putting some language in there to address the 2%?
No one's proposing, as I understand it, no one is proposing to add language that says 2%.
Not the language. I'm talking about the intent of the language here, not 2%.
Mr. Stevens.
I think the point would be that the 98% that would be authorized,
right,
whose exemption would be authorized, we are quite confident will not have a significant effect on the delta. And so we feel confident in including that exemption within the plan.
Right.
It's those 2% about which we have and will have no information because they don't go through the processes either of the Water Board or the Bureau of Reclamation or of DWR, that it's hard for us with confidence to say, hey, no problem.
Yeah, the only reason I mentioned that is that because I think the time frame for the 2-year time frame for coming back to look at the issue again to see whether or not it's some justification for doing something different makes sense. Yeah. My question is, which has to do with the process as we look at everything, will the council give direction to staff, or will the council vote on a section, or how would we come up with something finalized?
Here's the process. To take an action that directs staff to include something in the next version, or to remove it, or to change it, requires a vote of the council when it's on this list. The motion, if proposed, is adopted, treats the consent list differently. Members will pull items off and all that. But the staff has laid out all kinds of technical changes that get made. That'll just appear unless we squawk about it. Mm-hmm. For something like this, let's just talk about a procedure. The normal way to proceed is you'd say, I move the final staff draft be, whatever the terms and conditions of the motion are. Okay. And then you seek to amend or change that. That's one alternative. The other is just take these sections by sections and get the council determination on each section so that when the motion is made to whatever we do on the final, on the motion today or tomorrow, the changes that we will have made here are reflected in that. What's your preference?
I think that makes more sense.
The latter.
Yeah.
Latter. Okay. Then taking the issue identified as item number 1 regarding temporary water transfers. Mr. Fiorini's suggestion was we go back to the 5th staff draft, which grants an exemption for short-term defined as up to 1 year transfers, right?
Correct.
Okay. My suggestion as an add-on, which I think Mr. Fiorini sort of said maybe, is that provision be sunsetted, and I'd suggested 2 years, so that the study, work group, whatever it is that we are going to, we have recommended in Water Resources Recommendation 15 has a prod to actually complete its work on time. So once satisfied, this issue worked out, we can come back and clarify it. Now, I don't know. Don.
Yeah, that sounds like a reasonable course of action in light of what I've heard. But I'm just curious, though, if we get to a 2-year and there's still work going on, the exemption where sunset, is the default then it would go back to the staff option 1, where you would have coverage for the 98%, or basically everything at that point would be rolled into, there would be no exemptions there?
I think the default would then be the transfers, well, it depends how it's drafted, I suppose, Chris, but
It depends on what you want to do.
It depends on what you want to do.
Okay, well, again, recognizing the work is done here, I would suggest that might be a reasonable course, is that you take the original staff draft language from fifth draft, have a sunset, but also then recognize what's going to happen if you don't get there, recognizing how long it takes to work some of this out, but to utilize it certainly from a standpoint of using the chair's words to maybe prod that process. So, but if 2 years came and went, where would you be? And so I think there needs to be some clarity there as well. So.
May I make a recommendation on this?
Sure.
My recommendation would be to be clear by date certain, so 2014. The task force would come back with a recommendation to this council so that the language that exists that you approve in the Delta Plan will be the language. The task force is required to come back with a recommendation to you if it should change. So one recommendation could be no change. One recommendation could be we think there's appropriate language to change this. And so the affirmative action that the council would take would be based on the task force recommendation. You would affirmatively make a choice to change the language. So again, to be clear, what you end up approving today, or as part of the Delta Plan ultimately, if it's temporary water transfers for up to 1 year in duration or have an administrative exemption, that is what's in the plan. And what you were directing the group to do is to come back by date certain with a recommendation to you so you can consider whether that language should be changed.
Query. Mr. Natoli's question then is, well, that's okay, and if we do a sunset, whatever the sunset date is, but why would we not then retreat to the staff option 1 language? No?
Because I think that at that point, that's you could. The issue is the affirmative choice of the council to change the language. So one option for you would be, at that point in time, in 2014, the current option, the current language proposed by staff. But this way, I think for the people that are doing the transfers, there's clarity, of what the Delta Plan says until the council makes a change to the Delta Plan.
That makes sense.
Don?
No, I think that makes sense, Mr. Chair. I think
Okay, so
yeah.
not reference back the...
Right. So explain. So I think, as you've suggested, and Randy's offered up to make that, and then there would be a potential subsequent council action in 2014 when they had reports. So.
Okay, so let me just see if I can phrase this into a motion. And it would be to grant a short-term water transfer exemption as written in the 5th staff draft Delta Plan, but to sunset that exemption. Personally, I think you probably ought to put a more specific date than 2014. I think you ought to do December 31st, 2014. To sunset that exemption on that date, and to reference the recommendation, Water Resources Recommendation 15, which calls on the Water Board and DWR to work with stakeholders to recommend an appropriate process for handling this issue. Randy?
Yeah, I think, I know what sunset means. I think I would rather say that the council will review this recommendation no later than, and will be informed by the outcome of the water transfer work group.
Then you wind up with me going back to the other one that says you've got to actually reference the review for CEQA purposes by federal or state agencies. And if you want to I'd buy the staff recommendation on option 1. I'm for that, but you don't like that one.
I'm just leaving it open, that in
Well, but
a
see,
2-year
then
period of time.
the incentive is not to complete the work, and there is no prod of other agencies. We're not forcing them to do it, but the consequence is that the exemption is not automatically granted. Patrick?
Randy, is your concern the perception of the term sunset or the effect of terminating it unless some other action is taken?
Yeah, I think the question is, if this recommendation comes to an end, what follows? And rather than create that uncertainty, I'm just simply stating that the council, in our recommendation, should include a review point in time where it's up to us to either reaffirm this or to choose something else.
But if nothing happened, what would occur on December 31st, 2014?
That our recommendation for an exemption would go away.
Okay. Then I'd suggest sunset's an okay word to use. And in fact, it's used so often, at least in state law, that people's expectations is not really that the law is going to end, but that something's going to happen that's going to continue some version of it or the same thing. It's not as it's not perceived as a cliff.
Well, the necessary action would be for the council to meet and take action. That's the necessary
that's right.
action.
Right.
So the sunsetting.
But you have to be clear. You can't just say you're going to review the policy without. If nothing happens, does it keep going or does it stop?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we agree it stops unless some other action is taken by the council, right?
I accept that, and with the understanding that there is there will be a requirement placed on this council before whatever deadline we set to review it and take some action so that we avoid this uncertainty or lack of recommendation.
Ms. Gray?
It stops by 2014. The language I thought, which makes sense to me, is that it's, and kind of going back, maybe this is what Randy said, that in 2014, this council is required to look at this policy again, or this section again, and make some decision whether to continue the language that we have now or to readjust it. So I had a problem with the word sunset in the sense that it would stop. I think it makes sense to say the council is required to look at this issue again in 2014. That, to me, that language.
Right, and I heard Randy say that. I think you want to make sure that the council actually confronts it, discusses it, debates it, considers to continue it or change it. But the default in the policy has to say something happens, or else there really isn't an imperative for everyone to do their work. So I think the imperative is that at the end of 2014, it stops unless something else has happened. And you and Randy have said, well, we want to make sure we really review it, or whoever is sitting here really reviews it. And so maybe, Phil, that can be built in, a review 3 months ahead of time, or some such date certain that the council has to address it. But that the sunset, if you don't like that word, but it comes to a finality unless there's action taken.
Don?
Yeah, and I think that Pat's captured it. I think that you're looking to going to Martha's words, there's going to be some affirmation. Either there's going to be extension, you're going to keep it in place, you're going to modify it. But I think the imperative that comes behind looking at it, where this council then is required to do that beyond just, a default to either leave it in place or it goes away. I think that requires this council to then take some, at least take it up and consider it. And if it may be just an affirmation that it's working fine, we'll leave it in place, or we're going to modify based upon this working group's recommendations and all the public comments that will come in around that. But so sunset, I think, as Pat's offered it, in explanation, doesn't make me as uncomfortable as it might be if we just could drop dead date, and then there's this uncertainty out there that there needs to be some affirmation. So ever how you capture that in words, whether it's sunset or not, I think that needs to be clear. So.
Mr. Chair, can I just, why is it require a word that we could use rather than sunset? Requires the council.
This action
to do an
expires
action.
on.
Well,
I mean, it's an exemption you're granting from our activity to review something that might or might not affect the Delta plan. Law requires things that might affect the Delta plan to be reviewed. We can, however, by definition, say we believe that these categories of actions are likely not to need council review. So the question then comes up, if that exemption is clear, you've exempted the activity, but we are also, staff is recommending, that a more definitive review of this by the Water Board and by DWR would give us information where we might be able to better deal with the entire issue. How then to prod them to complete work by a date certain? Well, if the exemption has no end, then there is no necessity of them completing their work. So the theory is, how do you nudge those agencies to do a study we are recommending? And one way is to essentially say our exemption ends at a date certain.
Unless otherwise.
Yeah, and so
Unless the council
Pat
passes a resolution.
Pat didn't say it this way, but if December 31, 2014 is the date you hope that the agencies will complete the work, you would schedule a September review in 2014 of the activities to date and the possibility of success, allowing the council to act or not as it saw fit. Yeah, no, that would be, I don't know, that, yeah, I mean, right, if I'm writing this correctly, 1, adopt the language of the fifth draft Delta plan to grant the exemption through December 31, 2014. Number 2, reference in some way the recommendation, WR Water Resources Recommendation 15 about this DWR Water Board study group. And then number 3, return the issue of this action and exemption to the council no later than September 2014 to review and consider and take appropriate steps. Yeah. Now, I don't know, Chris? Okay. All right. Okay. Any questions on that? All right. Well, then let's do it. This is an instruction subject to the vote on whether we are asking the staff to advance with the draft Delta plan and changes. If we do, then this change would be reflected in it if there's a majority vote. Okay. Starting with Mr. Johnston.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Control aye.
Okay. We've got 6-0 on that. Okay. Now, let us walk forward to item number 2, please. This is on certification, the certification process on consistency, and relevant policies may not be feasible, and mitigation measures may be feasible, and so forth. So, Mr. Ray, I think you were doing this?
Yeah, and I'll hand this off promptly to our chief counsel, but this is designed to deal with, these revisions are designed to deal with at least 2 details that arose out of our attempts to clarify this policy. And again, GP1 is the policy that describes what the agencies that are approving actions need to do when they certify that those actions are consistent with the Delta plan. What we're proposing here is to deal with 2 details of this. One is, what do you do when you've got an action that's generally consistent with the plan, but it might have a problem of inconsistency with maybe 1 or 2 policies? What do you do when you think, hey, overall we're in pretty good shape, but we got a problem here, and we had included language that said, well, the council could, on appeal, make that determination that overall it was consistent with the Delta plan. other entities that might be approving covered actions that said, hey, what about us? Couldn't we make the same determination? And so we've tried to clarify that with this language that, yes, the agency that's proposing the action can make that determination. And then also the other question was, what is that agency's obligation to include the mitigation measures that are proposed in our EIR within their own action so that we can actually see that our CEQA obligations are being fulfilled. Several agencies pointed out that they may not have the jurisdiction to actually require mitigation measures that would be generally outlined in our EIR, and so we've tried to address language, provide language that deals with that detail as well. If I cover that correctly, Mr. Stevens?
I believe you have. If I could just chime in, I think, again, these are responding to stakeholder comments. They're kind of technical clarifications. We don't see them as controversial, but I think Dan described what we're trying to get at. The first one, again, had to do with what some people are referring to as the waiver process, where you're consistent with the co-equal goals, but there are just some of the policies where it's not feasible where you can be consistent. And the council, decided that there would be a process whereby proponents could identify those areas where they might not be consistent, and yet they still could be deemed to be consistent with the entire Delta plan as a whole. So a holistic approach, so long as they're not inconsistent with the co-equal goals. A couple stakeholders had pointed out the way we had drafted the language and how the certification process didn't entirely work, and so we listened to them and we made that clarifying change. The CEQA change, the bullet below, again, we have into the process previous that I was just talking about, we have the idea of feasibility. So if some proponent, it's infeasible for them to satisfy all the policies, again, they can be consistent with the plan as a whole. Similarly, with this bullet with regard to CEQA, the bullets in GP1 are all considered part of policies. We don't necessarily feel that the change that we made was necessary, but we heard stakeholders' concerns that in certain cases, as Dan alluded to, it wouldn't be feasible for them to actually require mitigation measures because, for instance, they may not have jurisdiction over enforcement authority. A couple agencies pointed that out. So we're trying to really respond to those concerns. Again, technical, hopefully non-controversial.
Natoli?
Yeah, either for Dan or Chris then. In the first part of the action where you try to clarify that it's not counter to the co-equal goals, but may not meet all the either objectives or language. So is that a subjective determination that the entity would make, but would have to offer a letter of explanation or some justification? And just what's envisioned there?
Let me start a little bit with that, because what we've tried to do is provide, in the plan, you'll recall that this was part of what was new in the sixth staff draft, was we tried to provide crisp definitions of water, what it means to have a more reliable water supply for California and what it means to protect, enhance, and restore the Delta. So that I think what it would require would be the agency to, adopt findings that would, show why they believe they're consistent with those two goals, and then wouldn't be subjective. There would be a factual basis for that, probably based on information that they developed through their environmental documents and public meetings and whatnot.
But just Dan, so it's not subjective, but it would be discretionary on the part of the agency within certainly the rules that they would operate on for any particular action, again, comporting certainly to the Delta plan.
And again, this is a policy that comes into effect if the agency has identified that they have a covered action. So if a CEQA exemption applies, it's a non-discretionary project. This is a covered action requirement, and you're right. We've said you have to identify, you have to present as part of your certification detailed findings as to which policies apply and why it's not feasible, hopefully why you are consistent, but in cases where you can't be because it's not feasible, you have to clearly identify that, and that's going to be part of your certification of consistency, and that's the basis for an appeal. So if an appeal were made by any person that the certification, that the appeals process plays out, the agency eventually will have to lodge what's called the record, which justifies why it made the findings that it did, why it filed the certification. So what Dan's talking about, that you will have to have a basis for making these determinations.
Okay, but it's within the discretionary action, recognizing that they have to comport with law, but they may make some interpretation, and that may be subject to challenge. Obviously, that's the idea of a covered action and an appeal. So I just wanted some understanding of the logistics of it. So they'll develop the record, and then if it's challenged, then it may very well come in the laps of this council at some future time. So, okay.
Okay.